Marcus Aurelius reigned from 161 to 180 AD, and the persecution under his reign was most severe in what was then known as Gaul, which we now today call France. The persecution of the Christians under the pagan emperors usually came primarily from political reasons rather than religious intolerance. And that's why we find the names of many of the best emperors, as well as those who were many of the worst, in the list of persecutors. The emperors believed that the welfare of the Roman Empire depended on the proper care being taken to worship the Roman gods. Even though the Roman emperors let all their subjects worship pretty much whatever they wanted, they at the same time expected that every province and every man at least was willing to burn incense in front of their idols and the emperor's statues. This the Christians plainly, simply, and obstinately refused to do. Their refusal to recognize the Roman gods angered the emperors, and the emperors believed that when those gods were ignored, that the gods became angry with Rome and brought wars and losses in battles and crop failures and plagues and death of important people and ships being lost at sea and drought and famine and earthquakes and severe storms and every other bad thing that could possibly happen to mankind from any source. Enforcing worship of the Roman gods was in the effort, in their mind at least, to avoid any bad thing happening to anyone. And anyone who would not worship was seen as someone who hated Rome and all of her citizens and was an enemy to the well-being of the empire and the life of every citizen of the Roman Empire, and it was obviously acceptable to the emperor and to the citizens to kill every person who would not worship the Roman gods. And this was the problem that the Christians had. Another severe persecution came during the reign of Severus, who reigned from 193 to 211 AD, and another during the reign of Maximin from 235 to 238 AD. And the seventh, what was known as the seventh persecution, took place under Decius, D-E-C-I-U-S, who only reigned for 2 years, but they were 2 terrible years, 241 to 251 AD. And last, the 10th persecution took place under Diocletian, D-I-O-C-L-E-T-I-A-N. That was the 10th persecution. He was emperor from 284 AD to 305 AD, and he was the last emperor before Constantine, who shortly thereafter accepted or at least took the Christian church under official protection of the emperor. Now, at first, Diocletian was very tolerant towards Christian beliefs and practice, and there is a record that his wife and daughter were at least Christian sympathizers, though they were never appeared to have been baptized. Later, however, he turned against the church and undertook to bring about a total suppression of the Christian religion. He ordered complete destruction of all Christian books, and I believe, and many other scholars believe, that this was a time when many of the scriptures were lost, totally destroyed. And he decreed a penalty of death against anyone who kept any Christian book in their possession. This may have been a time when many of the writings of the apostles were destroyed. And it's also probably a time when many of the fake gospel stories were buried. Give you an idea of one of the reasons why Diocletian was probably very upset. Fire broke out twice at the royal palace in Nicomedia, which was the eastern capital of the Roman Empire, close to where Constantinople is today in Turkey. And the Christians were blamed each time. For 10 continuous years, the Christians were the victims of never-ending rape, destruction of property, theft, beatings, torture, and death by the government and by ordinary citizens. At the end of the 10 years, the church was nearly destroyed. Many of the sacred records had been burned. Places of worship had been torn down to the ground, and many, many thousands of Christians had been put to death. Now, I'm going to give you a warning here that if you would be wounded by a graphic or upset by a graphic description of the torture of people, you want to skip from here all the way through to the next one. Just leave this one unlistened to, because the next thing is pretty gross. It is taken from the writings of a church author, Eusebius, who was writing at the time of Constantine. And he talks about some of the persecutions, some of the forms of torture, and these are horrible, but I'm putting them down so you understand what some of these people went through, and you understand how strong their faith had to be in order to endure through some of these things and how they saw it. So you're warned, shut it off now if you don't want to. I would recommend it for most people. Eusebius, referring to the persecutions of Egypt, says, "One cannot but admire." This is written in his Ecclesiastical History, which you can download, by the way. "Those who suffered in Egypt in their native land, where thousands, both men and women and children, despising the present life for the sake of our Savior's doctrine, submitted to death in various shapes. Some, after being tortured with scrapings, huge hooks were put on their skin and just tore through the skin and the rack, and the most dreadful scourgings," which means whipping, "and other innumerable agonies, which one might shudder to hear, were finally committed to the flames, burnt at the stake. Some plunged and drowned in the sea, others voluntarily offering their heads to the executioners, others dying in the midst of their torments, some wasted away by famine, and others again fixed to the cross. Some indeed were executed as malefactors, criminals, usually were. Others more cruelly were nailed head downwards and kept alive until they were destroyed by starving on the cross itself. But it would exceed all power of detail to give an idea of the sufferings and tortures which the martyrs of Thebes endured." This was in Egypt. "These, instead of hooks, had their bodies scraped with potsherds, which would be the sharp edges of broken pots, and were mangled in this way until they died. Women tied by one foot and then raised on high in the air by certain machines, with their naked bodies wholly uncovered, presented this most foul, cruel, and inhuman spectacle to all beholders. Others again perished, bound to trees and branches, for drawing the stoutest of the branches together by machines for this purpose, and binding the limbs of the martyrs to each of these branches, they then let loose the boughs to resume their normal position, designing thus to produce a violent action and tear asunder the limbs of those who this treated." People were torn apart by these tree branches. "But all these were not only for a few days or for some time, but for a series of whole years, at one time 10 or more, at another more than 20, at another time not less than 30, and even 60, and again at another time 100 men and their wives and little children were slain in one day, whilst they were condemned to various and varied punishments. We ourselves, when on the spot, saw many crowded together in one day, some suffering decapitation," means having their heads cut off, "some of the torments and flames, so that the murderous weapon, the axe that they chopped head off with, was completely blunted, and having lost its edge, broke to pieces, and the executioners themselves, wearied with slaughter, were obliged to relieve one another, take turns doing the killing. Then also we were witnesses to the most admirable ardor of mind and the truly divine energy and alacrity of those that believed in the gospel of Christ. For as soon as the sentence of death was pronounced against the first, others rushed forward from other parts of the tribunal before the judge, confessing they were Christians, most indifferent to the dreadful and many kinds of tortures that awaited them, but declaring themselves fully and in the most undaunted manner on the religion which acknowledges only one supreme God. They received indeed the final sentence of death with gladness and exultation, so far as even to sing and send up hymns of praise and thanksgiving until they breathe their last. The names of those blessed ones whose bones are strewn over the desert of Egypt are unknown to us, but are written in the book of life. At the day of the general resurrection they will rise and stand on their feet, a great army." That's what Eusebius wrote. These people counted it as a blessing to be persecuted for their beliefs as the Savior had been. I wonder how many of us would be as bold, as courageous, or as enduring.